The Fuel of War, December 17th, 1944. Near the Belgian town of Stavelot, snow fell in thick, soundless sheets, smothering the Ardennes in a white silence, broken only by the low growl of engines and the occasional crack of small arms fire. The pines were heavy with ice, bending under their own weight, as the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper, the elite vanguard of Hitler's surprise winter offensive, pushed west through the forest roads. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger, a seasoned officer of the 1st SS Panzer Division, rode in the lead half-track. The air smelled of diesel and cordite. His men were exhausted, their faces pale and hollow from 2 nights of near-continuous fighting. Yet in Kruger's eyes, there was a spark, the faint glimmer of belief that this operation, Wacht am Rhein, might just turn the tide of the war. Their orders were clear: strike fast, seize the Meuse crossings, and drive to Antwerp, split the Allies apart before they could react. But already, Kruger knew the plan was bleeding fuel. Literally, the panzer columns were running dry. Dozens of Tiger tanks sat idle behind them, their massive engines silent, because the jerrycans were empty. "Sir, the fuel's almost gone," reported Lieutenant Weber, clutching a clipboard as he climbed into the half-track. "We can make perhaps 20 kilometers, no more." Kruger's jaw tightened. "Then we take it from the Americans," he said simply. "They drown in it. We will drink what they spill." Moments later, the radio crackled with a breakthrough report. An Allied supply depot, captured intact on the outskirts of Stavelot. Fuel. Thousands of gallons of it. Enough to keep the panzers moving, at least for a while. By the time Kruger arrived, black smoke was already rising from burning trucks. The depot stretched across the frozen hillside, rows upon rows of drums, and tankers gleaming under the snow. The scene looked almost surreal, like a mirage conjured from a soldier's dream. 50,000 gallons, Weber said, breath visible in the frigid air. All American. Kruger walked among the tanks, running a gloved hand across the cold metal. The label on one drum read U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. He smirked. 50,000 gallons. He repeated, "That's life for a few more days." But even as his men cheered, siphoning the precious liquid into captured trucks, Kruger's mind was troubled. He had once served in logistics. He knew the arithmetic of war. 50,000 gallons sounded vast. But what if it wasn't? What if this miraculous find was a drop in an ocean he could never cross? The snow thickened. Somewhere in the distance, the drone of American aircraft could be faintly heard through the cloud. Kruger stared into the white expanse and wondered if even this victory, this frozen oasis of fuel, could ever change the course of a war that had already run dry. Section 2. The Illusion of Plenty. The air was heavy with the stench of gasoline and smoke. Columns of grey exhaust drifted between the rows of vehicles, as German mechanics worked feverishly to refuel tanks and half-tracks. Snowflakes hissed and melted on the hot engine block. Somewhere, an SS sergeant shouted for more jerrycans, while a squad of infantry hauled barrels up the slope, their boots crunching in rhythm. Colonel Kruger stood apart, watching the frenzy unfold with quiet intensity. He knew the men needed this, not just the fuel, but the feeling of triumph. After weeks of retreat and ruin, this depot was a rare symbol of hope. They laughed, slapped each other's shoulders, even joked about marching all the way to Antwerp. Perhaps the Führer was right after all. Weber muttered beside him, "Maybe this offensive will show the Americans we still have fight left." Kruger didn't answer. His eyes traced the long rows of barrels stretching into the fog. It looked like a sea of abundance, but his mind was already calculating the consumption rate of a Tiger tank, the range of a half-track, the demands of the entire division. He pulled a pencil from his coat and began scribbling figures in a small field notebook. 50,000 gallons. Each Tiger burned nearly 5 gallons per mile. A single armored column could devour the depot's contents before the week was over. He frowned. The math didn't lie. This treasure trove that had sent cheers through the ranks was barely enough to move one division across the Ardennes, and the Americans, they had hundreds of depots like this, thousands of tankers crossing the Atlantic every month. Colonel Weber asked, noticing his expression. Kruger snapped the notebook shut. We keep refueling. But this is not victory, Lieutenant. This is survival. At that moment, a nearby tanker roared to life. An American M4 Sherman, freshly captured, its white star painted over with a crude black cross. German mechanics grinned as they tested its engine. To them, it was proof that fortune favored the bold, but Kruger only saw desperation. The Wehrmacht scavenging, like vultures on the carcass of an enemy too vast to comprehend. From the ridge above he could see the blackened skeletons of burned-out trucks, and the frozen corpses of GIs scattered along the road. War had stripped everything bare. Even victory looked like theft. As night fell, Kruger gathered his men inside the depot's main storage hangar. The lanterns flickered, casting long shadows over the fuel drums. He unfolded a map of the Ardennes on a makeshift table. The route to the mowers was marked in red pencil. Beyond that, Antwerp. We move at dawn, he said. Every vehicle fueled, every man ready. We take the mowers or die trying. The men nodded grimly. Outside, snow covered the ground once more, concealing the muddy tire tracks and footprints of the day. The forest fell silent again, as if holding its breath for what would come next. Kruger lingered at the map long after the others had left. His gaze rested on the small American fuel depot marked with a circle. Their prize. He thought of the factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, running day and night, pouring out tankers faster than he could destroy them. For the first time in years, he felt the faint chill of inevitability, a realization deeper than defeat. No matter how many gallons they stole tonight, Germany was already running on fuel. Section 3. The Road of Fire. December 18th, 1944. Before dawn, the Ardennes forest pulsed with life. Engines rumbled beneath the trees as hundreds of German vehicles lined the narrow, icy roads. Tank crews huddled beside their machines, breath rising like mist, waiting for the order to advance. Colonel Kruger moved between them, his greatcoat stiff with frost. The night's snowfall had buried much of the depot, but the vehicles were now refueled, the men ready. Somewhere deep within him, he hoped that the gamble might still pay off, that if they could reach the Meuse River, perhaps the Americans would panic, perhaps the front would collapse. The radio crackled. Forward elements ready, Herr Oberst. Road to Tripont secured. Kruger climbed into his command half-track and nodded. Move out. Engines roared to life. Tigers, Panthers, and half-tracks rolled down the narrow road, steel grinding against the frozen surface. Snow kicked up behind them like ash. For several miles progress was smooth, until the first sharp bend, where the road narrowed between two ridges. There the lead tanks slowed, and Kruger saw why. The road ahead was jammed with abandoned vehicles, German trucks wrecked by artillery, or out of fuel. Men cursed, trying to push them aside. Get them off the road, Kruger barked, stepping out into the cold. The echo of his voice vanished into the forest. He saw men draining the last drops of gasoline from disabled vehicles, filling flasks and cans. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had captured 50,000 gallons, and still it wasn't enough. Overhead, the clouds began to thin. A streak of sunlight broke through the mist, and then came the distant hum. Aircraft. American jabos. Someone shouted. Cover. Kruger dove for the ditch as the first P-47 Thunderbolt screamed overhead, its machine guns ripping the road apart. Tracers tore through the line of trucks. Explosions sent fuel barrels spinning into the air like flaming comets. The smell of burning fuel filled the valley, thick, acrid, choking. Flames rolled through the column, consuming tanks, vehicles, men. Kruger crawled behind a tree, coughing. The heat was unbearable. Through the smoke he saw the depot's stolen fuel. Their miracle turned into a river of fire. that ran down the slope, igniting everything in its path. "Mein Gott!" Weber gasped beside him, face blackened with soot. All of it gone. Kruger didn't answer. He could only watch as the sky burned. When the thunderbolts vanished, silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant groans of wounded men. Half the convoy lay destroyed. Weber stared at the inferno. "We'll never reach Antwerp now." Kruger's voice was hoarse. "We never would have." He stood slowly, surveying what remained: twisted metal, shattered drums, the charred corpses of his soldiers. 50,000 gallons, captured at such cost, wasted in a single attack. He realized then that fuel was more than a resource. It was the heartbeat of war, and America's heart would never stop beating. Kruger turned toward the forest. "Get the survivors moving," he ordered quietly. "We fall back to La Glaise." Snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the blackened road. The fire hissed beneath it, a dying flame in a war that was already lost. Section 4. Counting the cost. The retreat through the Ardennes was grim and methodical. Columns of battered vehicles creaked along snow-laden tracks, men frozen to the bone, their faces pale under layers of grime and frostbite. Colonel Kruger rode in the lead, his coat buttoned tightly against the wind, eyes scanning the ridge lines for enemy patrol. Every shadow, every snap of a branch, could mean another ambush. The loss of the depot weighed heavily. 50,000 gallons of fuel, gone in a flash. A brief hope turned to ash. Soldiers muttered about luck, cursed the Americans, and whispered that the war was slipping from their grasp. But Kruger's mind calculated further. He thought of all the other depots he would never see, of the endless Atlantic convoys bringing tankers full of oil across the ocean. Untouchable and inexhaustible. By midday, the survivors reached La Glaise, a small village now crawling with wounded and retreating troops. Fires burned in makeshift braziers, the smoke mingling with the bitter smell of frozen mud and diesel. Kruger dismounted, his boots sinking into the slush. He walked past soldiers hunched over injured comrades, past the hollow-eyed men who had witnessed the destruction of their captured prize. In the command post, a commandeered farmhouse with walls blackened by soot, Kruger pored over reports and maps. Every new message confirmed the nightmare. American reinforcements were pouring in from the west. British and Canadian units were preparing to counterattack, and fuel convoys were still streaming across the ocean. The calculations were staggering. One captured depot, one fleeting victory, meant nothing in the face of that industrial tidal wave. Lieutenant Weber approached, holding a small clipboard. "Sir, casualties are heavy." "The men there," his voice trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Kruger didn't need words. He could see it in the haunted faces of his men. The Ardennes Offensive had been meant to ignite hope, to show that Germany could still strike decisively. Instead, it had revealed the impossible odds, the sheer scale of the Allied advantage. He sat by the window staring at the frozen landscape outside. Smoke still rose faintly in the distance, a reminder of what had been lost, a symbol of fleeting triumphs, swallowed by relentless reality. Kruger spoke softly, almost to himself. "We can take fuel, we can take towns, but not the oceans they sail upon, not the factories that churn night and day, not the spirit that feeds this." The room was silent, except for the faint scratching of pencil on paper, as he calculated losses and projected outcomes. He knew with a sinking certainty that Germany's fate was sealed. No single victory, no matter how glorious, could reverse the outside. Snow continued to fall, erasing footprints, covering wreckage, and muffling the cries of the wounded. The Ardennes, once a stage for hope and ambition, had become a graveyard of illusions, and Kruger understood, fully and finally, that the war had already turned against them. Section 5. The Weight of Realization. Night descended over La Glaise like a heavy curtain. The village was quiet now, the sporadic gunfire from distant skirmishes fading into the wind. Soldiers huddled in doorways, around meager fires, attempting to stave off the cold that gnawed at fingers and faces alike. The only sounds were the occasional groan of a wounded man and the muffled orders of officers trying to organize what remained of their shattered units. Colonel Kruger stood on the ridge, overlooking the village, his binoculars trained on the horizon. The snow reflected the moonlight, transforming the forest into a vast, pale ocean. Somewhere beyond those ridges, the Allies were regrouping, their tanks and trucks readying for the counterstroke that would soon sweep through the Ardennes. Kruger's mind drifted back to the fuel depot, the gleaming rows of barrels, the elation of capturing such a treasure. It had felt like salvation, but now, with the loss of so much and the relentless advance of enemy forces, the magnitude of their disadvantage was painfully clear. 50,000 gallons of fuel, a fortune in his hands for a few hours, was nothing more than a drop in the Atlantic of Allied reserves. He felt the weight of the war press down on him, not as a strategist calculating maneuvers, but as a man confronting a simple, bitter truth. Germany could not match the industrial might of America, not in tanks, not in artillery, not in fuel. Lieutenant Weber approached cautiously. His face was drawn, etched with exhaustion and fear. "Sir, the men, they're talking, they're losing faith." Kruger turned to him, his eyes shadowed. "Faith," he repeated quietly. "Faith does not win wars. Fuel, men, weapons, those win wars, and we are running out of all three." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, carrying the scent of snow, smoke, and burnt diesel from the forest. Kruger knew that morale was fragile, and once it broke, the offensive would collapse entirely. He descended from the ridge, walking among his soldiers. They stared at him, waiting for orders, for words of encouragement. He offered none. Instead, he inspected vehicles, checked fuel lines, and marked routes on maps, the cold, meticulous work of a man who understood that hope alone would not carry them forward. Inside a small command post, Kruger finally allowed himself a moment to sit. He picked up a map of Europe, tracing the lines of Allied supply routes and industrial centers: Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, names of cities that were as distant as they were lethal, pumping endless resources into the war effort. He realized that even if every depot in the Ardennes were captured, it would scarcely dent the flow of American fuel. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The exhilaration of the previous day, the joy of a seemingly great prize, had been replaced by a quiet, crushing despair. The truth was undeniable. Germany's doom was not in battles lost, nor even in tanks destroyed, but in the vast, unyielding industrial engine that continued to feed the Allies. Kruger understood that this knowledge would change everything. Orders would be followed with obedience, but without conviction. Soldiers would fight, but the spark that made men unstoppable had dimmed. And in that moment, high in the cold night of the Ardennes, Colonel Wilhelm Kruger, victor of the fuel depot, realized the bitterest truth of all. They were running on borrowed time. Section 6. The Shadows of Defeat. December 19th, 19. Frost clung to the rooftops, glinting like broken glass, and the distant ridges were veiled in a ghostly fog. The village was eerily quiet, the chaos of the previous days replaced by a tense anticipatory stillness. Men moved like shadows, dragging themselves from makeshift bunks and doorways, their faces hollow, their hands shaking from cold and fatigue. Colonel Kruger mounted his half-track and rode along the perimeter, inspecting the units. Tanks sat idle, half buried in snow, engines cold and silent. Artillery pieces were stacked like monuments to past ambition, untouched, unused, yet desperately needed. The reality of the Ardennes Offensive, its overreach, its flawed planning, weighed on every move. Reports arrived constantly. Enemy units were converging from multiple directions. Artillery fire was intensifying, and air reconnaissance confirmed the Americans were massing reinforcements faster than the Germans could counter. Kruger knew the offensive's window was closing rapidly. The depot's fuel, once a beacon of hope, had been destroyed or consumed. Even what remained in jerrycans would barely carry them through the next few days. He dismounted near a ruined farmhouse, listening to the murmurs of his officers. Lieutenant Weber approached again, eyes downcast. "Sir, morale is collapsing. Men speak openly of retreat, of surrender. They're done." Kruger's jaw tightened. He knew that morale was as critical as fuel or ammunition. The Ardennes campaign had been meant to inspire, to shock the Allies, and perhaps even turn the war's tide. Instead, it had revealed the limits of German resources and the vastness of the enemy's power. He walked among the men, observing them with the keen eye of a veteran. A corporal, frostbitten and trembling, clutched a frozen rifle. A group of Panzer Grenadiers huddled in the corner of a barn, whispering about food shortages and the hopelessness of their mission. Kruger could see fear reflected in every glance. Inside, in the dimly lit command post, he spread out a large map. He traced the supply lines, the rivers of fuel and men that flowed into Allied hands from ports and factories, beyond Germany's reach. Each line seemed endless, unstoppable. He realized that even the most daring strike, capturing depots, sabotaging convoys, burning towns, could not stem the tide. For the first time, Kruger allowed himself to confront the truth fully. The Ardennes Offensive, despite its audacity and fleeting successes, could not win the war. It was a gamble, brilliant in conception, but doomed in execution. The Americans could replace men, tanks and fuel faster than Germany could ever destroy them. He stood by the window, watching the gray light of dawn touch the snow-covered street. Somewhere beyond the hills, the hum of distant engines hinted at the approaching storm. Kruger understood the harsh reality. His men could fight valiantly. They could achieve temporary victories. But the war itself, the war of resources, industry and relentless production, had already been lost. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent. It blanketed the village, masking the scars of battle, but not the truth. The truth burned in Kruger's mind. Germany was not out of hope. It was out of time. Section 7. The final calculations. By midday, the command post had transformed into a hub of grim activity. Maps were sprawled across tables. Messengers arrived with updates, and the steady rhythm of radio traffic underscored the tension. Kruger moved between officers, checking coordinates, listening to reports, his mind already running the numbers. Every calculation confirmed the same unshakable truth. Germany could not sustain the Ardennes offensive. Lieutenant Weber approached with a fresh report. "Sir, the Americans have established new supply depots beyond Bastogne. Fuel convoys are moving faster than we can intercept. Their armor divisions are replenished and ready to counterattack." Kruger's eyes narrowed. "How many trucks?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Thousands, sir. Hundreds of thousands of gallons at least. Even if we capture everything within reach, it will make no dent." He nodded silently, staring at the map. The numbers were staggering. 50,000 gallons had seemed monumental, a lifeline, but against the vast ocean of Allied reserves, it was meaningless. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth. The elation of capturing the depot, the brief surge of hope, now replaced with a profound despair. "Order all units to conserve fuel," he commanded finally. "Every drop must count. No reckless movement. No heroics. We survive as long as we can." Officers saluted and dispersed. But the weight of Kruger's realization hung in the room. Every man present understood the implications. The Ardennes offensive was a high-stakes gamble, but the deck had been stacked against them from the start. Every depot captured, every village seized, every tank deployed. It was a fight against an enemy whose strength was measured, not in bravery or courage, but in factories, oil fields, and oceans of supply. Kruger walked to the window again, staring at the frozen forest beyond the village. The snow muffled all sound, hiding the rumble of approaching American units. He thought of the men who had cheered when they found the depot, their faces alight with hope. Now that hope was gone, extinguished by the simple arithmetic of war. He understood, finally, that victory was no longer a question of strategy, skill, or courage. It was a matter of resources, of endless production that Germany could never match. 50,000 gallons of fuel, stolen from the enemy, had illuminated the harsh truth. The war was already lost. Kruger closed the map and turned to Weber. "We do what we can, for as long as we can," he said quietly. "But remember this, the Americans have oceans of fuel, factories that never sleep, and a will to fight that cannot be drained. No depot, no village, no daring strike can change that. We are already behind." Weber's face reflected a mixture of fear and reluctant understanding. Outside, the wind whispered through the snow-covered streets, carrying the silent echo of thousands of soldiers' footsteps and the distant thunder of approaching Allied columns. Kruger stood in the command post, feeling the bitter weight of inevitability pressing down upon him. The Ardennes had shown courage, audacity, and fleeting success, but it had also revealed the unyielding scale of the enemy's power. Germany could fight, yes, but it could not win. And in that moment, the colonel realized that sometimes the truest defeat was not on the battlefield, but in the numbers, the calculations, and the inexorable truth that no human valor could overcome the tide of history. Section 8. The Ardennes Winter. The Ardennes was a winter wasteland, its forests and villages frozen under thick blankets of snow. A bitter wind cut through the trees, biting the skin and rattling the eaves of half-collapsed houses. The German soldiers moved like ghosts through the icy streets of La Glaise, their breath clouding in the cold air. The loss of the captured fuel depot hung over them like a shadow, a cruel reminder that their war was fueled more by hope than by actual means. Colonel Kruger rode along the convoy route, inspecting the battered vehicles and weary crews. Tanks groaned under the weight of ice and snow. Half-tracks skidded through slush, their engines sputtering as they struggled to maintain momentum. Soldiers trudged alongside, rifles slung, boots frozen solid, faces drawn and hollow. At the edge of the village, Kruger stopped by a group of men huddled around a small brazier. One young soldier held a jerrycan, the last precious fuel in his possession, and stared into the flames. Kruger approached silently. "Keep it safe," he said quietly. "We need every drop for the coming days." The boy nodded, eyes wide with fear. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The silence was eerie, almost unnatural, broken only by the occasional crack of distant artillery or the howl of the wind. Kruger's mind drifted back to the depot, the gleaming barrels, the fleeting triumph, the fire that had consumed it all. 50,000 gallons had felt like salvation. Now, even a fraction of that would have been invaluable. The reality was crushing. No single victory could stem the inexhaustible tide of Allied production. America's factories were limitless, their oil fields secure, their supply chains unstoppable. He climbed back into his half-track and drove slowly through the village. Houses were empty, windows shattered, and the snow was stained with mud and soot. Each destroyed vehicle, each frozen corpse, told the story of a gamble that had failed, a plan that had overreached, and a nation that was already running on borrowed time. As the convoy prepared to move again, Kruger reflected on the human cost. Men had died for a few days of fuel, for a dream of turning the offensive into a decisive strike, but the dream had been an illusion. The war was no longer about individual heroics, skillful maneuvers, or daring captures. It was about the cold, relentless arithmetic of production, resources, and endurance. He looked down at the frozen road ahead, knowing that every mile forward would cost lives. Every engine rev would burn the fuel they did have, and every engagement could end in further devastation. The Ardennes winter had become more than an enemy. It was a mirror of Germany's situation, harsh, unforgiving, and inevitable.
Kruger's resolve hardened. They would fight. They would survive as long as possible. But he knew the truth, that few dared to speak aloud. The war was already lost, and no depot, no daring strike, no temporary capture could reverse the task. Snow continued to fall, soft and silent, erasing tracks and masking the scars of battle. Yet beneath that white blanket, the reality remained, a reality Colonel Wilhelm Kruger had finally understood. Germany's doom was not in the battlefield defeats, but in the inexorable, unyielding supply of the enemy.
Section 9. Echoes of Reality. Night fell over La Glaise once more, heavier this time, as though the darkness itself carried the weight of inevitable defeat. Inside the command post, Colonel Kruger sat alone, a small lamp casting flickering shadows across the walls. Maps, reports, and discarded pencils littered the table before him. Every message received that day had reinforced the same harsh truth. The Americans were unstoppable, their resources endless, their capacity to replace men, tanks, and fuel infinite. He thought back to the depot, the moment of triumph, the rush of adrenaline, when 50,000 gallons of fuel had come into their hands. How quickly that elation had turned into ashes. The fire that had consumed the captured fuel now seemed symbolic, a reflection of the fleeting nature of any success Germany could claim against the overwhelming might of the Allies. Lieutenant Weber entered quietly, bringing with him a cup of black coffee. "Sir," the men asked for guidance, orders, something to hold on to. Kruger took the cup, hands shaking slightly. He could see the fear in Weber's eyes, mirrored in the faces of every soldier under his command. He had spent a lifetime planning, calculating and executing campaigns, but nothing had prepared him for this realization. The enemy's strength was not in strategy or valor alone. It was in fuel, in factories, in an inexhaustible stream of resources that no daring offensive could overcome. He spoke softly, almost Oz himself, as he traced routes on the map with his finger. They have rivers of fuel, oceans of tanks, mountains of men, and here we are, trying to survive on what we can steal, what we can burn, what we can scavenge. It is not courage that fails us. It is arithmetic. Weber looked at him, swallowing hard. "So, what now, sir?" Kruger's gaze lifted to the frozen village beyond the window. Smoke from small fires spiraled into the night sky. The soft crunch of snow underfoot, the only sound from outside. Now we endure. We fight where we must, withdraw where we have no choice, and pray that what remains is enough to keep the men alive. Victory is no longer ours to claim. That is gone. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the wind carried the distant echoes of artillery, and the faint hum of American trucks moving inexorably forward. Kruger felt the weight of the world pressing down, a knowledge no soldier wants but every commander must face. Some defeat is not a matter of bravery or tactics. It is the simple reality of overwhelming odds, of oceans of resources that cannot be drained, of a war machine too vast to halt. He drained the last of his coffee and stared into the darkened room, shadows flickering over the walls. The Ardennes Offensive had promised glory, but it had delivered clarity. The depot, the captured fuel, the fleeting triumphs, they were all illusions, brief lights in a storm too immense to navigate. Kruger understood now that the war was no longer about battles won or lost on snow-covered roads. It was about the inexorable power of supply, the relentless output of factories, and the sheer scale of an enemy whose strength could never be matched. The future of Germany had been written long before they reached the Ardennes. The capture of 50,000 gallons of fuel had only confirmed it. Section 10. Acceptance and Resolve. December 21st, 19. Snow clung to the trees like frost-encrusted sentinels, and the wind carried the faint sound of distant artillery, a reminder that the front was still alive, still moving, still claiming lives. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger rode slowly along the village streets, observing the weary faces of his men. Their exhaustion was palpable, their morale fragile,
And yet they obeyed orders without question. Discipline, for now, held where hope had begun to fade. Kruger knew that the loss of the fuel depot had struck a deeper wound than the battle itself. 50,000 gallons had been a symbol, a brief glimmer of possibility, but its destruction revealed the truth that every German officer feared to admit. They were outmatched, not by strategy alone, but by an enemy whose capacity to wage war was practically limitless. He stopped at a frozen crossroads, surveying the burned-out husks of vehicles and tanks that littered the snowy road. Each one was a testament to ambition, daring, and the high cost of miscalculation. The snow muffled the groans of the wounded, the crackle of fire, and the occasional whistle of a distant shell. Here Kruger understood that survival had become the only objective that mattered. Lieutenant Waber approached, face pale from cold and fatigue. "Sir, we can try to regroup, consolidate forces. Perhaps we can stabilize the line." Kruger's gaze hardened, though there was a strange calm in his eyes. "Yes, we fight where we must, Waber. We survive where we can. But know this. No capture, no raid, no victory will change the bigger picture. The Americans have oceans of fuel, factories that never rest, and a tide of men that cannot be stemmed. 50,000 gallons. It was nothing but a mirage." The young officer nodded slowly, comprehension dawning. Around them, soldiers shuffled in the snow, checking weapons, fueling what remained, preparing for another day in the relentless winter. They would march, fight, retreat, and endure, because that was all that remained to them. Kruger turned his gaze westward, toward the distant horizon where the snow met gray sky. He did not feel despair as he had yesterday, only a cold clarity. Germany's defeat was inevitable, but that did not absolve them of duty. Courage, discipline, and resilience would carry them through the coming days, even if they could not change the outcome. He whispered to himself, almost as a vow, "We cannot win the war, but we can endure it, we can survive it, and we will make them pay for every mile they take from us." The snow continued to fall, soft and unrelenting, blanketing the devastation, masking the scorched roads, and silencing the cries of the fallen. Yet beneath that white layer, the truth remained, a truth Kruger now accepted fully. Germany was doomed. The fleeting capture of fuel had shown them their limits, and now, with grim resolve, they would continue the fight, aware that they were battling an enemy whose resources were as infinite as the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes.